Hello everyone. I want to create a few videos covering components lifecycle because it's a very important topic and it's very critical to understand the various different states of a component's lifecycle. Blazor components are stateful component, and if we don't have a good understanding of the component's lifecycle, as developers, our mind can be confused and we don't know where to put the logic that we want to implement. Today, I want to cover one of the core concepts of component lifecycle, which is when do components render? Components actually render under four conditions. Components render when components are just created, or when components events are triggered, or when components parameter values are changed, or when developers manually trigger the rendering of the components. So let's cover them one by one. First one is when components are just created, right? So let's take a look at Visual Studio. So this is the project that I just created with Blazor WebAssembly, and let's see. The first one is the components renders when it's just created, right? So this one is easy, right? The reason it's obvious that when a component is created, you want to render the component. Otherwise, like it's a UI component, right? So it needs to be displayed. So, but when is component actually created, right? So the components are created when you just load the component for the first time, or when you navigate away and navigate back, right? Or you try to refresh the page and the components are recreated. So let's see whether that's those three things that I said is true or not. So let's take a look at the counter component. Okay. Let's see if we override on after render method, and if we run this. So we pressed Alt Shift D, and so this is the page as we see, right? And we're using Chrome, so we just copy this, right, Control C, and then we use Windows R. See, it's writing right here. So Windows R, and we paste that in, and then click on OK. So we'll open another browser. So this is actually the browser that we need to use in order to debug. So from here, we do Control Shift D again, and this is the window that is launched. So from here, we can actually set breakpoint. So go to the files folder, and then we can see all of even the program files, right? So we can go to our counter component and see whether this is rendered. But debugging this is pretty tricky. So if we just refresh this counter page, we can see that the breakpoint is not actually triggered. So yeah, it doesn't actually trigger the breakpoint for the first time when the component is just created. So in order to debug, go to our code, and then we can just write console.writeLine, and this is very similar to console.log in JavaScript. And then we save it and we build it. So once we build it, we come back to this developer tool, and we go over here, refresh it, and come back to the developer tool. If we look at the file is actually changed, as you can see. Let's refresh again, and then we go to the console, and you can see that on counter component on developer render is rendered at this time. So now we know that when a component is just created, the component is rendered, right? Because this event is only triggered after it renders. So this kind of proves that the event is just rendered. Another possibility is that if we navigate away, right, and we navigate back, then see the breakpoint is also triggered, and its first render is true, meaning that it's just rendered. It's just created, therefore it's rendered, right? So those three conditions. First one is when you just come to the page, Second one is when you refresh the page. Third one is when you navigate away from the component or from the page and come back to that page that contains that component. Then the component is created, therefore it's rendered. The second one is the component renders when the component's events are triggered. So for example, in this counter component, some people think that this current count, only when the current count changes, do the components actually, does the component re-render, but that's not actually true. So let's actually comment out this line and then rebuild the application. And once that's done, let's go back to here and let's refresh the page, right? Once we refresh the page, we can actually go to the source code and we can see that the counter component actually doesn't have that. See, this is the counter component, so this is already commented out, right? So this line will not actually run at all. So what we can do here is that we click on it. See, these after render event is also triggered. So this proves that as long as there is an event that is triggered, then the component is re-rendered, right? And you can see that this parameter is false, meaning that this is not the first time. This is not the components just created. This component already created, and we clicked on a button, and that button does nothing, but the component is still re-rendered. So that's the first point I want to emphasize here. The second point is that when events are triggered, that's true, but it's not every single type of event. It has to be a UI event, like clicking a button, change a drop-down list, that sort of thing. It has to be a UI event. So let's do a demonstration. That what if we are increasing the counter count by a timer, right? So if we come to the application and if we add a timer here, so basically we create a timer that runs every 2 seconds, right? 2000 milliseconds. And then it triggers the increment count function to increment the current count value. And let's run it and see what happens. So let's refresh the page. So it picks up that. And you can see that the current count is not actually increasing. But if we go to the page here, we go to the console, we can see that the counter value is being increased every 2 seconds, right? But this event is not a UI event, therefore it's not rendering re-rendering the component, even though the variable's value is actually being changed. And if we click on it, you can see it's 18. Why it's 18? Because it's 18 right here, right? It's 18 right here. That's when it rendered, because we clicked on that. And that's a UI event. That's why it has this. So that's that one. As long as it's not a UI event, it cannot. For example, if you have an event in a child component or in a parent component, and you're implementing a method that registered to that event, and when the event is fired from the parent or the child components, and you have a function within this component to be called, and even when there's variables that are being changed, and that even when that variable is actually being used on the UI, your component will not be re-rendered just because it's not a UI event, right? So similar to the timer event. So another point that I want to emphasize, when the component UI events are triggered, the components re-rendered. That's usually the case, but that UI event has to happen within the component, right? It cannot happen outside the component. If it happens outside the component, it's not going to be rendered. So for example, if you have a parent component, the parent component has a button, and if you click a button, click on that button in the parent component, the child component will not be re-rendered, right? And if you have a child component that has a button, you click on that button, the parent component cannot be rendered, will not be rendered. We can do a demonstration, but let's stop this timer. So I want to create a component right here. Right, you can see the component is rendered. And if you go to our developer tool, you can see that the content component rendered and the child component also rendered. The child component rendered after the content component render, after the parent component render. But if we come over here and click on the click me button, and we go over here, you can see the content component is rendered again, right? But it's not actually triggering a re-rendering of the child component. The child component is not being rendered. So if I'm going to click on this a few more times, right, you can see it's all about the content component. The child component is not rendered, right? And the same thing will happen again if you put a button under the component under the child component, and you're gonna see that the child component renders. Let's actually do that. Let's go to the child component, and let's put a button right here, and let's have a method. Right, and we refresh, and we come to the window, clean it up, click on click me. We'll see the child component actually rendered. I also click on it a few times, three more times, you can see. Right. So the important thing to notice here is that although the event handler here is not doing anything, you have to have an event handler in order for the component to re-render, right? Although it doesn't do anything. And also another thing, you notice that the rendering is only the child component renders. The parent component actually does not render, right? So, and but there's only one exception. So this is the point that I want to emphasize, that the event has to trigger from inside the component. Only when the event that is triggered inside the component, does that same component gets re-rendered. So, but there's only one exception when you use a templated component, right? So let's say that we have a template. So I have covered the templated components in a couple of videos, couple of episodes ago. So if you are not familiar with template components, please go back and look at my previous videos. And refresh. We see this click body template, and let's clear the console, and we click on the body template. I click on it once, and we see that the content component gets rendered, and the child component also gets rendered. Right? So if I click on 2 more times, 1, 2, go here, you can see that both content component and child component get rendered. So why is that? Well, the reason is that the body template is kind of special, that when you have buttons or HTML elements within the body template or a template within a template, it's also considered part of the child component, right? It's considered, so this button is considered part of this component. So when you click on the button, it's as if you're clicking a button within that child component, right? It's actually part of that. It's actually within it. But because the fact that it is also part of the, it's also defined right in the parent component, so that's why the parent component is also rendered. Okay, so that's the second bigger topic here. The components re-rendered when the component's events are triggered. So I covered the three important things I want to emphasize again. So events, we don't need variables to be changed as long as you have an event handler for event. Even the event handler, you do nothing about it, the components also gets re-rendered, right? The second important point is that the UI, the event has to be a UI event. Any other events like a timer, timed event, or a event delegate, you register to an event delegate within some other components, and that event gets triggered within this component will not be re-rendered when the event happens. The third thing that I wanted to emphasize is that the event has to be triggered from inside the component, not outside the component, except for one case, that if you have templated components, then that template, the event happens within that template, triggers both the parent and the child component. So okay, so now let's move on to the third thing, which is the component parameter values changed. Well, this is a simple one. If we go over here and we go to component, and if we create another parameter, and that parameter would be the counter. If we just display the counter value right here, so where's the counter? Okay, and from the parent component, if we feed that counter value right here with the current count, then every time you click on the button, every time you click on this button, the Clean Me button, your child component also gets re-rendered, right? So let's delete everything that is distracting. And we don't need this either. We don't need the template component. We don't have this, and we don't need this. Rebuild it. So here, if I click on it, you can see that the counter value does not change. So because we are not passing it, and if I click on it again, you can see that the only thing that it changes, it gets re-rendered, is the count component, which is the parent component. But if we go to here, go to the parent component, and if we pass that parameter right over here to be the current count, and if we build this and we refresh the page, and while we click on it, we can see that all of them, so both the parent component and the child components get re-rendered every time we click on it, right? So you can see both are re-rendered. So that's the third. And the fourth condition is when developers manually trigger the rendering. So again, if we remove this, and if we just come over here and even we remove this, and if from here, if we reference the child component, let's say child, and then over here we can say private component child. Alright, so this is that component, and if we just every time we do this, we say child.counter equals current count. If we do this, let's see what happens. So basically we are increasing the counter value of this property. Right? It's not a parameter, but we're not expecting that this value would change. So you can see that it's not changing, right? Although the value gets increased. The only reason why it's not changing is because the child component is not rendering. That's because none of our 4 conditions are met, right? We're not doing any of these, so the child components is not being re-rendered. So in order to re-render, we have to, as developer, we can manually trigger that re-render. We can have a public method called re-render. This state refresh, and we call it, and then when we come over here, we can call child.refresh, and that will trigger the re-rendering of the child component. And let's go over here, refresh the page to pick up the change, and let's do this. You can see that both the counter component and the child component pick up the change. And if we go over here, we can see that both are re-rendering. Okay, so that's everything I want to cover today. Remember, there are only 4 conditions that the components get re-rendered. First is when components are created. Second one is when components events are triggered. Third one is when components parameter values are changed. Third one is when developers manually trigger the re-rendering. Alright, thank you very much for watching. And if you like my videos, please give it a like and subscribe. And I'll see you in future videos. Thank you.